have Seanan McGuire. Seanan McGuire writes a lot of things. It can be difficult to make her stop. She lives here in the Pacific Northwest in a somewhat idiosyncratic house overlooking a large swamp and is very pleased with the situation. Her work has won the Hugo, Nebula, Pegasus, and Alex Awards, and she spends a lot of time trying to keep the cats from knocking them over on guests. Her latest book, That Ain't Witchcraft, came out earlier this month, so welcome, Seanan. Next, we have Silvia Moreno-Garcia. She is a World Fantasy Award-winning editor and author of the Mexican vampire novel Certain Dark Things. Her upcoming novel, Gods of Jade and Shadow, involves Mayan gods in the Jazz Age. She has just sold her first non-speculative book, a crime novel set in a shark fishing village called Tide Rack. Welcome to Silvia. Next, we have Jenna Glass. Jenna Glass made her foray into feminist epic fantasy with The Women's War, but she wrote her first book, an autobiography, when she was in 5th grade. She began writing in earnest while in college and proceeded to collect a dizzying array of rejections for her first 17 novels. Nevertheless, she persisted, and her 18th novel became her first commercial sale. Within a few years, Glass became a full-time writer, and she has never looked back. She has published more than 20 novels under various names. Welcome, Jenna.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Next, we have Katherine Arden. Katherine was born in Austin, Texas, but spent a year of high school in Rennes, France. Sorry, I pronounced that totally wrong. Following her acceptance to Middlebury College in Vermont, she deferred enrollment for a year in order to live and study in Moscow. In Middlebury, she specialized in French and Russian literature. After receiving her BA, she moved to Maui, Hawaii, working every kind of odd job imaginable, from grant writing and making crepes to guiding horse trips. Currently, she lives in Vermont, but really, you never know. She is the author of the national bestsellers The Bear and the Nightingale, The Girl in the Tower, and The Winter of the Witch. Welcome, Katherine. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Robin Hobb. Robin is a fantasy novelist best known for her works in the realm of the Elderlings, a series of books that began with a Farseer trilogy. Born in California in 1952, she grew up in Alaska, spent some time in Colorado and Hawaii, but for the past few decades has resided in rural western Washington. Her most recent trilogy was the Fitz and the Fool trilogy. The concluding volume, Assassin's Fate, was published in 2017. She also writes as Megan Lindholm, and that entity has a short story, Second Chances, in the forthcoming anthology, Unfettered 3. So, welcome to Robin. And I am Anne Groell. I'm your moderator. I am a 27-year veteran of science fiction and fantasy editorial. I started at Avon Books in 1992, moved on to Bantam Books in 1994, and have quietly been there ever since while they changed companies around me about 5 times. So we are in the Fantasy in the Mix panel. So one of the things that I think makes a writer is being an avid reader from a very young age. So I wanted to start a little bit with some of your early reading habits, since I'm sure while all of us love fantasy, we didn't start ourselves limited to fantasy. So going down the panel, I'd just like to ask, what did you read as a kid? What genres or books were most influential to you? And if you could speak a little to that.
I read the Pleasant Hill, California County Library.
Oh, excellent. Very good.
I started at the beginning, and when I reached the end, I stopped.
Fantastic.
My favorite book as a kid was Watership Down because it was really thick.
Excellent. Sylvia?
We didn't have young adult or children's literature in Mexico growing up, so the first things that I read were Greek mythology, and the things that were considered kids' books back then were, you would read The Three Musketeers. So that was how I started reading.
I read pretty much any genre. You put a book anywhere near me and I'd grab it. I did read a lot of fantasy, starting with The Lord of the Rings. But I also read a lot of classics because I'm one of those weird kids who actually enjoyed the classic literature back then.
I read a lot of fairy tales. I was a huge fan of like Tamora Pierce and Robin McKinley, kind of like the first wave of young adult literature. And I also read a lot of historical fiction, like The Witch of Blackbird Pond, like Johnny Tremaine, like those sort of classics. I loved books like that. So
I started out reading a lot of fairy tales. I think growing up in the 50s and 60s, I read a lot of the typical kids' books of that era, which would be all the books about the Black Stallion. just a lot of that, and a lot of the classics of the time that everybody expected you were going to have read. Treasure Island, Kidnapped, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, all of the required reading list of that time.
Well, we know that Shauna's favorite book was Watership Down. As a kid, is there one book that you can point to that probably most influenced you or was most seminal?
The Jungle Book, it's a passion that George Martin and I share, and I think that the wolves that run through both of our long expanded trilogies owe a lot to Aquila and the Pack.
The Hero and the Crown by Robin McKinley was a hugely important book for me growing up.
Excellent.
The Lord of the Rings, for sure. And I was also a big Watership Down fan. I read that 1,000,000 times as a kid.
Well, genre-wise, I ended up doing a lot of work with H.P. Lovecraft. Like, the reason why I won the World Fantasy was I did the first all-woman anthology inspired by the work of H.P. Lovecraft, and I also did a thesis which analyzed the works of H.P. Lovecraft from a eugenics standpoint. So I would say that was probably the most influential of the early readings in the sense that I actually did something with it later on.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it was Tanithly's Silver Medal Lover. Another excellent.
Have you read the sequel?
Yeah, I actually asked her for the sequel. I edited the sequel. I talked to her on the phone, and I said, Silver Medal Lover is my most favorite book in the world. She's like, I'm thinking of a sequel. I'm like, so the sequel is dedicated to me.
I love you! Oh my God!
That is the power of an editor.
Even though I'm a professional editor, I still get these moments that give me like chills.
You made me so happy! I was so happy when she wrote a sequel to my book! Oh my God, sorry. We return to the panel already in progress.
Serious times now.
There should be an entire panel about editors and the things they have actually, how they move the publishing field. Anne also edits George R.R. Martin, so you can blame all of that on her too. So.
Yeah.
Among others, yeah.
So, as an adult, did this pattern change for you at all? And if so, how? What are your favorite kinds of books to read now that aren't fantasy? What do you like dipping into when you have a moment? Want to start with Robin and then go that way?
My watershed moment was in my middle teens when I discovered and read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Up to then, I'd read a lot of fantasy and a lot of pulp age stuff, Doc Savage and Conan and all of those things, Tarzan. But suddenly, this was a fantasy world that took itself very seriously, that had maps and a previous history, and where the characters and their lives truly mattered. And at that moment, I knew that was what I wanted to write.
Let's see, probably other than fantasy, I read the most historical fiction still. It's a genre I always come back to. And honestly, I do feel like historical fiction was the fantasy literature before fantasy was a genre. Because it was like people's first attempts at imagining worlds other than their own. And it wasn't like imaginary worlds, it was past worlds. So, and I still love historical fiction. I read a ton of it, so it's probably my go-to genre, actually.
Is there a favorite book you want to point people to? Because I love getting people reading lists.
Yeah, my favorite author is Dorothy Dunnett now, who is an author that has a very small, very passionate fandom. And her first book is called Game of Kings, and I'm sure George R. R. Martin read her. Because she also does multi-point of view big books where she kills a lot of main characters. So, but it's a fantastic book set in the Renaissance in Scotland, and it follows this sort of outlawed young nobleman named Francis Crawford of Lymond across these different adventures, and they're brilliantly plotted, brilliantly paced, brilliantly like written, researched. It's amazing. So, yeah.
Like I said, I kind of read everything, and I go on these spurts where I'll read tons of one particular genre, whatever, you know, my genre du jour or whatever. I often read a lot of suspense and mystery, mainly because that's what my husband reads, and he'll say, oh, this is a good one, and I'll pick it up and start reading it. But I've read history, I've read romance, science fiction, fantasy, young adult. I'm a slut. I don't know. Yeah, you got a genre, I'll read some of it.
Any favorite recent non-fantasy book to recommend?
Recent non-fantasy. Does science fiction count? Or is that?
Sure.
The Ancillary Justice series by Anne Leckie, which I discovered because you put her name on a list, and I was like, ooh, I didn't know her, and I started reading that. Loved it.
Silvia, what about you? What other genres do you like to read?
I actually review fiction in translation for NPR, so I have a stack of books in translation. I specifically like crime fiction in particular, but, you know, anything in translation.
And one to recommend in particular that people should check out?
I really like The Wolf and the Watchman. It just came out, I think, this month. It's a historical fantasy set in the early 1800s in Scandinavia. And there's a gruesome murder, and this guy who is consumptive and this other guy who is this one-armed, kind of like gigantic guy have to find out who was killed and why. And I described it as Game of Thrones is actually a lot more optimistic than this book. So it's very violent.
So the initial question was, how has our reading changed?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I grew up so far below the poverty line that you couldn't see it on a clear day, which meant that I could not have standards because what I had to read was what my mother found at a yard sale for a penny. And I had to reread. Any book I owned, I would read 5 and 6 and 7 and 12 times because there just weren't enough to keep up with me. And one of those, it sounds like it's not a problem, but it actually can be a problem, things about becoming a professional author is people start sending you books. They want you to blurb books, or they just want to share their books. You're always in contact with other authors. You have so many opportunities to buy their books. You want to support them. For the first time in my life, I have a to-be-read pile. It weighs substantially more than I do. And I started getting really squirrely and unpleasant to my friends until one of them said, honey, when is the last time you reread it? Because I have reread it by Stephen King every single year since I was 9 years old. And I had gone 3 years without reading it because I felt obligated to the unread books on my bookshelf. And it turns out I can't do that.
No,
Psychologically, it's not good for
friend.
me. I need the rereading to stay sane.
Yeah.
Which was a fascinating discovery. As to how my reading has changed, I both don't have as much time to reread. And again, I had no standards as a child. I was one of those hyper ahead of her age group kids that just skipped anything that doesn't make sense. So I not only didn't realize how much sex was in some of the books I was reading, I had no idea how much sexual assault was in some of the books I was reading. And now you get one rape, and if it's eroticized in any way, I will never read anything you write again. That is not what I am here for. I don't have time. I wish I did. As to a book I've read recently that I would actually recommend picking up Winternight by Ruth Anna Emrys, which is basically an inversion of the Cthulhu mythos told from the perspective of one of the last deep ones in the world, and it's genius. It is one of those books that I got halfway through it and then texted the author and said, hey, does anyone else know you wrote this? If I killed you, could I have it?
And that's a high compliment from an author.
That's a high compliment. If I cask of Amontillado to you, would I get your work?
So I want to talk to Silvia and Katherine for a minute to discuss history, because both of you have written books that are heavily influenced in history. So Silvia, let's start with you. Why did you pick the Jazz Age in Mexico? What about that time period spoke to you, and how did knowing about that period in history influence the book?
The Jazz Age in Mexico is a really important time period. It's just right after the Mexican Revolution, so the construction of the modern Mexican state is beginning. It's kind of one of the dividing moments that you can see in a line. But the other thing is that I wrote this book thinking about my great-grandmother, who was an illiterate maid, and I wanted to give her the chance to go on an adventure. And she was young in the 1920s, so she had told me stories about when she was young, folklore and things like that. So it was a time period that I enjoyed because of that. And it's just an interesting time period in general, the science, the society, the way things are changing. Fashion is strikingly different from the fashion of previous decades, and the way men and women are interacting and all that kind of thing. So it was just I thought the perfect time period for the book.
Excellent. And what about you, Katherine, with medieval Russia in your books?
Well, I I knew I wanted to do a book based on a fairy tale, and on a Russian fairy tale. I lived in Moscow for 2 years by the time I started writing The Bear and the Nightingale, my first book. But I felt like there were so many sort of cliches associated with Western writers writing books set in Russia. Like you have sort of this onion dome, snowy landscape, troika, I don't even know, samovars, like tsars, this list of things we associate with Russia. But the thing is, in the Middle Ages, none of those things had happened yet. This is pre-Ivan the Terrible. It's, you know, pre-onion domes. There's no St. Basil's in Moscow. And so I felt like setting the book that early would be a way to sort of shed a lot of the baggage that we carry reading books set in Russia and approach the topic with more of a clear perspective. Also, the Middle Ages are this very sort of not well documented, not well known time period in Russian history. And so the book I was envisioning that mingled sort of myth and history seemed like an easier sell in a time period that's already kind of not well known. So.
Okay, so then Shannon, Jenna, and Robin, I wanted to talk briefly about pseudonyms, because I know both of you write under at least 2 names, maybe sometimes 3 or more. So do you find you're a different writer when you're writing under your other persona? Do you have a different way of approaching it, or is it purely a market-driven decision? Do you write books as the other person? Do you write as yourself and then decide what name to put on it later? So can you start with Sean and talk a little bit about that process?
I always wear the same bra. I'm not 2 different people. I don't have a magical serum that takes all the evil out of mankind and causes David Hasselhoff to start serenading me. It was a market decision. Yeah. It was for the same reason that Disney created Touchstone Pictures back in the 90s, so no one could ever utter the words, Walt Disney presents Reservoir Dogs. And unfortunately, it was a misogyny-driven decision to a certain degree, because Seanan McGuire is an urban fantasy author. I have to talk about myself in the third person here. I sound even less with a grip on myself than it does. Seanan McGuire is an urban fantasy writer. Right. And an unfortunate number of men will not read urban fantasy because they have this idea that all urban fantasy is vampire porn, which is silly, because I also know men who really enjoy good vampire porn, so I don't know why this would be a gender thing, but it is. Urban fantasy is marketed primarily to women. It is one of the very few female-dominated subgenres, and so a lot of men feel that they are not welcome or wanted there, or that it would somehow not appeal to them. And when I brought my zombie political thriller trilogy to the editors at Orbit, they were like, yeah, this is going to crash and burn like the Hindenburg, because no men will read it, and men are most of your audience. And they were not wrong. Right. They put a new name on the cover. They did let me have a female pseudonym. There was no, you have to hide who you are. There was just, we need to make this marketing distinction. And unfortunately, I do believe they were right. I stopped counting at 20 because I want to have some faith in humanity. But I have had more than 20 people, all men, come up to me at signings to say that Feed or Parasite or one of my other works as Mira is their favorite book, that it changed their life, that they're so glad they found me, and that if they had known I was Seanan McGuire, they would never have picked it up.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these things work. Jenna?
Mine was also a marketing decision. I'd been writing as Jenna Black for many, many years, and I had romance and urban fantasy and young adult all under that name. And so I needed to sort of show that this was a different genre, because it is, you know, it's always my voice. No matter what it is, it's my voice. But there's still, this book is different. It's more politically connected. It's openly feminist, even though I think all my other stuff is pretty feminist too. It's just more veiled. And also, my last couple of books as Jenna Black didn't do super well, so it was time to have a change.
I think there is a long, fine tradition in the genres of writers having multiple names. Some of the early science fiction and fantasy magazines that would come out, you would actually have one writer who had written like 4 or 5 stories, and so they actually had names that they recycled there at the publishing company, and they said, okay, this time we're changing your title, and this name is going to be used on your story. And as long as they were getting paid however many pennies per word it was then, nobody really cared. So again, changing my name was not a huge decision for me. I felt I was following sort of a tradition. And again, it was a sales decision. I had written quite a few books as Megan Lindholm, and the reviews were very, very nice, but the sales were very, very mediocre. And so with Farseer Trilogy, because we were starting in a different slice of the fantasy genre, my agent suggested, let's try a different name. And we carefully constructed the name Robin Hobb. I went to bookstores and I looked at what books were at eye level on the shelves. I love Zelazny, but you have to kneel down to find him. And Asimov's was way up in the corner. So on the H shelf was Robert Heinlein, Barbara Hambly, Frank Herbert. It was a really nice neighborhood, and I decided I was going to move into that shelf. So I wanted a short name that goes in nice big letters on the cover, and I wanted the name to have a nuance. Hobb is like a hobgoblin. It's like put the kettle on the hob. It's also the first half of the word hobbit, which is something that was pointed out to me years later, but I really like that. Robin, I wanted an androgynous name because I was writing in first person male, and one of the jobs you perform as a fantasy author is to lower the threshold of disbelief as far as you can. And so by putting it as Robin, I left it up to the reader to worry about it because I wasn't worried about it. And again, Robin has a lot of very nice nuances, from Robin Hood to the first Robin of Spring. So it's a very carefully constructed name. Ralph and I were very pleased with it when we put it out there.
I admit part of Grant was being able to be on a shelf with Stephen King if the bookstore was laid out correctly.
Yeah.
Like, it's right there.
Exactly.
Look at that.
So, but Robin, you still write stories as Megan Lindholm. Is there a conscious decision you're making when you're writing something that this is going to be a Robin Hobb story versus a Megan Lindholm story?
That's absolutely true. Robin Hobb tends to sprawl, to go into detail, to tell you backstory, to embroider the stories of the more minor characters, whereas Megan Lindholm is a name I use for urban fantasy, for shorter works where I'm not going to sprawl. So it's a different writing style, as well as a different feel for the kind of stories. I would never write a story like Cut as Robin Hobb. The Kelsey stories are definitely a Megan Lindholm creation rather than Robin Hobb's.
So I know that some of you in the audience are wannabe writers and are interested in the craft of how people got started. So I wanted to talk a little bit about everyone's first novel. I do love Jenna's story about having 17 in her trunk, which I think shows an amazing persistence and shows all of you out there who think, you know, you're doomed at 3, that you should keep going. So briefly, can we talk a little bit about what was the very first book you wrote? What kind of book was it? What was it? And was that actually published or not? So why don't we start with Robin and work this way?
My very first book was Harpy's Flight by Megan Lindholm, and I went about getting it published in all the wrong ways. I had, at that time, 70s, the path to being published was supposedly to get a number of short stories under your belt so that you could show an editor, look, I can write a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an ending, and then to submit your book. At that time, little tiny magazines existed called fanzines, kind of the equivalent of e-zines today. I submitted a story to Jessica Samuelson at her fanzine, which I believe, reaching back, was called Fantasy and Terror. She happened to be editing an anthology for DAW at the time called Amazons, all in caps with an exclamation point. And instead of taking my story for her fanzine, she took it for her anthology. That anthology went on to win a World Fantasy Award that year, chiefly, I think, because of a story by, was it Elizabeth Bear in there? Paxanaran? Anyhow, so it was
Elizabeth Moon.
Elizabeth Moon. Thank you.
Paxanaran, yeah.
I always scramble those. Elizabeth Moon's Paxanarian novel, I think, was why that story went on to be, my story got read a lot more because of her story being in that same anthology. An editor named Terry Windling read the anthology and was talking to Jessica Samuelson and said, I really liked that story by Megan Lindholm. I wonder if she's going to write a book. And Jessica Salmon called me up and said, why don't you quickly write a book?
Oh, yes, quickly.
Well, as it happened, I had 2 separate stories about Key and Van Dien, the same characters, that would actually fit very well together, with one being told in flashback. So it was like taking chapters and doing a big shuffle, and I sent it to Terry, and she bought the book. It's all the wrong ways to be published, but it worked.
Yep.
I sort of slid sideways into publishing. I went to college and I wanted to be an interpreter. I was a French and Russian major. I had fluency in both. My goal was to work for the UN. But after I finished college, I decided to take 3 months off afterwards and live on a farm in Hawaii and pick coffee.
As you do.
As one does. My parents weren't very excited, but it was, I just wanted a break. Like, picking coffee is pretty mindless. I just wanted to, like, shut down for a couple months. I was tired of the cold, too. I'd been in Russia for 2 years, and I'd been in Vermont for 3, so I was over the cold. So I went there, and picking coffee is really boring. I don't know if you're surprised, but it is really boring. And so I decided to start writing a book to entertain myself. And I'd just gotten back from Moscow. I decided to do a book set in Russia based on a fairy tale. And I wrote it. And about 3 months in, I was like, this is fun. I'm enjoying this. I'll try to publish it, with not much idea about what that entails. But I eventually did. And that was my first book.
So you were asking about first book, whether it was published or not, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Biography.
Yeah. Well, there was my 5th grade autobiography, but I'll go for novel. My first novel I wrote while I was in college, and it was a science fiction novel, and it was heavily influenced by the Hitchcock movie Lifeboat, where these people were stuck in a lifeboat together, and they were all really different and set up for conflict. So I came up with this really bizarre idea where these people were stranded on a planet, and they'd been given some kind of weird drug that was making them take on each other's personality, and they were, of course, were people who were guaranteed not to like each other or get along at all. So it was kind of bizarre, and I'm sure if I went back and looked at it now, it was really juvenile. However, when the first time I submitted it as a novel, I did get not an offer, but I really enjoyed this, and if it, we just have to cut back on first books right now, so I can't take it. And I thought, ooh, I'm really close. And, so I thought, yeah, I can do this. And, 17 books later, I was still really close. And that's part of why I didn't quit, is I kept getting close enough to feel like, oh, it's just there if I can just stretch a little more.
But I gave you a chance.
You did. Although you were not my first.
I was not your first.
Oh, yeah. You were my second.
That's only your second. Goodness gracious! Now.
Yeah, you have to try out. Yeah, you have to, get that first one out of your system. Right?
Yeah.
Then when you have a little more experience.
Now I really need an adult.
Sylvia?
I've been writing since I was a teenager, but my first kind of modern adult book was kind of like a Mexican Little Women, because it was 4 women's perspectives, and it was over 4 sisters' perspectives over a period of 20 years. It didn't work out. I couldn't get an agent for it, but I know an editor who's called Nick Mamatas, and his advice is that you send out your manuscript to 12 agents, and if one of them replies with either a request for a partial or a full, you can write, and even if you don't place that, maybe write another book. But if you get 0 requests for partials or fulls, take a year to learn how to write. So I did get some requests for partials and fulls. Nothing panned out, but I knew I could write, and I just needed to write something else.
Good advice.
My first book was Rosemary and Rue. It was also my 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, 8th, 10th, and 13th book.
Ooh, excellent.
And then it was my first published book.
Great. So, let's see. We're talking about fantasy in the mix, so maybe we can just jump in as people have ideas. But I know that it's odd in publishing because, of course, there are us editors and publishers who are the gatekeepers of such things and say, well, that won't sell. But in an ideal universe, is there any kind of genre you'd love to see mixed with fantasy that you think hasn't been done yet, or some sort of a mashup that would be fun to do, even though we might say no to it because we're terrible and evil?
I can give you an example of literally every subgenre I can think of being
Yeah, I feel like
mixed with
every
fantasy.
genre has been mixed with fantasy at some point. There's like fantasy mysteries and fantasy romances, and there's fantasy like historical and
Fantasy thrillers and
Thrillers.
fantasy horror and fantasy steampunk and fantasy Lovecraft.
I can tell you one that is actually a hard sell that I tried. It's epic fantasy contemporary set. Because before I wrote this one, I had done this contemporary epic fantasy. And it was, at that point, it was the book that I had the most editors who wanted to buy it, and they were all really interested, and their marketing departments all said, huh? I don't know what to do with this. So that's one I'd love to see.
How does that work? Because like if it's contemporary, it's like set in today now, but it's fantasy, but it's epic fantasy. Hope.
Yes.
That's what they said too, yeah.
How are you defining epic fantasy?
Yeah.
There's the
Well,
question.
in the scope of it, it was a big, it was contemporary world, but with this whole other race of human beings who had different powers with a different deity and lots of different storylines that were interconnected.
So it was urban fantasy.
Sort of. Yeah, I mean, that was the problem. It was really hard to put a label on it.
Genres
And
can be hard.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like.
So, what I was thinking of was epic when I was working on it, taking the bones of how an epic fantasy is put together and then setting it in a contemporary world. And that was just, whoa, I don't know what to do with that.
Well, that's sort of another thing, is that everyone, I think, has a very different personal definition of what is a fantasy novel.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if any of you want to leap in with what you think that your definition of a fantasy novel is, I always find it interesting to see what people's perceptions are. So I think we are all different.
I do think the definition of fantasy has either narrowed or broadened because so many books have fantastical elements. Like Hamlet has a ghost, Exactly. Like it's got an old history, but like the modern fantasy novel doesn't usually include like Hamlet in that definition. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like so it's really what we say it is in a lot of ways.
This is one of my favorite hobby horses because I will argue that all fiction is fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that it not only is all fiction fantasy, but it's fantasy is our universal language. If I say Thor, everybody in the audience has some concept of who that is, even though it's the Norwegian, Norse god, right? If I talk about Peach Boy, a lot of you are going to pick up on that. If I talk about the Great Flood, all of these fantastic stories are basically our cultural literacy. And then you come to the New York Times bestsellers where The Lovely Bones, which is that's definitely not a fantasy, except it has a ghost. And you have television series. I'm trying to think of the one with the oppressed women with the red hoods. The Handmaid's Tale. She was originally nominated for a Nebula for that, which she did decline because she did not want to be grouped in as fantasy or science fiction. But how is it not? So I would say fantasy is actually our big overarching literature, and then everything breaks into pieces underneath that big umbrella.
I kind of agree with you that fantastic elements are universal, but I disagree that any of the ones you cited are our cultural language because there are so many different cultures coming to this party. And what I picture when you say Thor and what Jenna pictures and what Silvia pictures are not all necessarily the same. But more importantly, if you went to some of my relatives who are still in Moldavia and said Thor, they don't know who that is necessarily, or they think Marvel owns him, or they think he belongs to those weird racists who keep chasing them out of their hometown. So ghosts are kind of universal. Every culture we've found that has a large body of water has some kind of people who live in the water, water spirits or mermaids, but they don't manifest in a universal way. Dragons are not universal. Everyone sees a different dragon. So I don't
But
like.
but we all see dragons. And I guess I'm phrasing this poorly, but to say that if you take a fantastic story from another culture and bring it to me and rewrite it in English so I can read it, I am going to probably fall in love with it, simply because those fantastic elements are part of our universal storytelling. Our once upon a time, the young person who goes off to seek his fortune in the world and encounters something that he thinks nobody or has ever encountered before. So I see it as and the way, yes, we do devour the literature of other cultures and the legends of other cultures, and then they become my literature and my legends. And oh yes, you can call it cultural appropriation, but you can also call it, you know, our big melting pot, where we the
I am
other
not part of a
becomes the
melting
us.
pot. I am sorry.
Oh, okay, and I respect your I respect you and your opinion on that. But having grown up with a very, very jumbled heritage myself, I devour all things.
Devour is a good word, actually, to define some of the way we consume the products of others and think that we can chew on them all the time. So,
So I would like to open to audience questions. So if anyone has a question and wants to come up to the mic, please do so. In the meantime, I just wanted to, while people are gathering, if anyone has anything to say, but I wanted to ask everyone on the panel, I know that a lot of you have written about a vast variety of different places and times and subjects, and you do a lot of research in your writing. What is one of the coolest bits of information that you have come up with in your research for a novel that is particularly fun and cool?
I know how to masturbate an elephant.
That is different, yes.
It feels real weird, too.
I'm sure it does.
Oh, God.
do you, Jenna? Do you know how to masturbate an elephant?
I do not.
If y'all don't ask questions, I will teach you, so please.
To research fantasy, you often have to research what your characters know about so that you can present at least enough that it seems to the reader that you know about it too. So I researched beekeeping and learned how people used to be able to find a beehive in the wild and then how to bring it back and make it your domestic bees. And I thought that was fascinating. And it still works. The bee line is definitely a very fascinating part of nature.
We have a question, so if you'd like to.
One thing I've heard several times over the course of the morning, both in the panel before this and now, is that a lot of publishers have difficulties with putting a book in a niche. How difficult is it to market a mixed genre book, and what are ways that you can present a book that would be more palatable to an editor?
Yeah, editor, how difficult is it to market a mixed genre book?
It can be actually very difficult. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to do as publishers and editors is sort of, unfortunately, bookshelves have boxes and sections where you need to put books. So in some ways, it helps if a book is a majority of some genre. So if you can say this is a majority fantasy novel, but it has elements of mystery and history, then that's very easy. If it's a 50-50 split and it's hard to say which it is, it almost makes it unpublishable, unfortunately, which I wish were not the case, because there are a lot of amazing books like that. But, you know, the way the market works dictates a certain way that books are published and books are presented. And it does make it hard. There have been plenty of books as an editor that I've fallen deeply in love with, and we haven't found a way to market effectively, and it breaks your heart. It really does. I mean, that's the hardest part of the job.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, if you look at any new successful subgenre, they tend to be launched by female authors, queer authors, and authors of color, because those are the groups that can't find themselves represented in what's on the shelf right now. So they go, oh, clearly this subgenre is not for me. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to start writing my own thing. But when you have that big breakout book, the successful book that creates a subgenre, yeah, start there and start going backward and looking for the corpses. Urban fantasy really kind of launched into public consciousness enough that it became a marketable genre with Laurel K. Hamilton, who mostly writes porn now. The more recent Anita Blake books are just porn. There's nothing wrong with that, but please do not take me calling them urban fantasy as an endorsement of the more recent books as urban fantasy. They are really not. But before Laurel Hamilton did that, you can find the Scribblies, you can find a lot of the work that Terry Windling did. I actually cite Emma Bull's War for the Oaks as the start of modern urban fantasy, but it was a commercial failure because people were not yet used to the idea of urban fantasy. Yeah. So follow the new subgenres and look for the corpses. You'll find a lot of female authors, queer authors, and authors of color who never got a second chance.
Good point.
Okay, so I guess my question is kind of a two-part. My favorite genre is sci-fi western. Mm-hmm. So my question would be, do you have some good recommendations for me, and what's something that you enjoy seeing in that particular split subgenre?
I thought Cowboys and Aliens was great fun, and of course there's also a comic book that it's based on, so that might be something to look at.
I mean, the genre classic is Dark Tower, I would say, although it's Western fantasy, but if you haven't read it, it's gigantic and amazing.
I mean, it's a bit of a harder one because from, again, the evil publishing standpoint, Westerns don't tend to sell that well right now, so we
no Western shelf anymore.
Yeah, we get a little skittish.
Well, it's because of all the white penises. We're really tired of those. Yeah.
And your second part was?
Oh, what's something that you want to see in that genre?
Oh, okay.
Indigenous writers?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Decolonialization of the Western genre.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi. You were talking about, that you read somebody's book and they get a certain number of, difficult topics and then you're done. Are there things that you've found both as authors in your personal reading and writing and as an editor that it's just, no, not there, don't go there, or, well, that sucks, but it's really necessary for the story, or are there just some things, and not specific necessarily, but there are some things you just simply don't do?
I would say that I would agree with the point that Shannon made earlier, that I don't like rape written from a lascivious point of view or of the point of view of the perpetrator. That to me is a huge, I'm putting this down and walking away, this book is not for me.
I would say also, gratuitous descriptions of bodily functions. Like, if it's so gross that you stop being in the story and start thinking,
ew.
it doesn't actually add anything because it knocks you out. So that's, I think, something to watch, too.
I often read a lot of romance, and the one thing that will make me close a romance is a guy saying, tell me no, if you're going to stop me, tell me to stop now, because otherwise I won't be able to stop, which is supposed to be romantic somehow, but to me it's like, I'm about to rape you. So that is the absolute close the book for me.
Oh yeah, like that last chance woman moment in love scenes, it's so common.
Yeah, it is, and it's
really
so
common.
gross.
Yeah.
You're talking about reading or writing?
Reading.
Yes.
Reading. Same thing, extremely graphic, pornographic scenes that don't have any consent in them are hard to get through. Yeah. So, and I won't buy, there's specific subgenres of forced romance. You can find them online if you want them. Like, he can't stop himself, he's an alpha werewolf, he has to take her. So I just won't read that.
Yeah. There's no topic I say you can't write about, but you have to consider the genre you're in, how you're approaching the topic, and whether you're treating it like a magical candy surprise for your reader to find. Animal death is not a surprise that I want randomly. So I don't mind it if it fits the story, but set it up. Rape is not a great surprise, but Robin McKinley's Deerskin is one of my favorite books, and it does not function without the rape. It is a book about the consequences of suffering rape. Mm-hmm. The Hate You Give is a book about racism in many ways. A lot of other things, that's an incredibly narrow way to describe it. I don't mind the racism in the book because it's not fetishized. It's not presented as okay somehow. Anything can be a perfectly reasonable topic to read or write about as long as I trust the author to take care of me, and as long as if you're the author, you're looking at it and going, will this hurt someone? Is this a rock? Do I need to throw this rock?
And as a clarification from publishing too, you had asked about is there a topic that's important enough to publish even if the book is not good? And unfortunately, the answer to that is no. We have to have a good story and a good vessel for talking about it, and otherwise it's just not worth our while.
Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hi. So as someone who likes to create and write stories, and as someone who has ADHD, I have a tendency to write a story halfway and then forget about it and end up with like dozens of half-finished stories. How do you avoid starting a new story when you haven't finished an old one?
How old are you?
I'm almost 16.
You're 16, cool. Do you live with a family member?
Yes.
Awesome. Talk to your family member, say that you want to, I have OCD, which has some very similar behaviors, and this helped me. Talk to the family member you live with and go, hey, will you pay me $5 for a finished story? No, I'm serious. Will you pay me $5 for a finished story? Great. When do you want it? And talk to them and go, I can write 100 words a day, reasonably. And I think that this story, if I go all the way based on what I've done to the halfway point, if I go all the way to the end, I think it's a 6,000 word story. So if I will give you this story on June 1st, will you give me $5?
Okay.
And that gives you a deadline, and it gives you being paid, and that will really help to keep you focused.
And if you become a professional writer, those are two things that are very important.
Yeah.
Deadlines and being paid.
If I don't write, I don't get to pay my bills, and my cats will eat me. So you can harness it. You really can harness it. Your ADHD, OCD, a lot of those neuroatypicalities, they are great big machines rumbling away inside you, and they want to do stuff. They want to eat stuff. They want to eat the world. You can put them in a harness and make them eat the world for you. And this is part of the way to train them to do that.
Thank you.
I'd also like to make a quick suggestion, which is that I had that same problem up through my 20s. I had thousands of partially finished stories. My difficulty was I could never decide on the ending. And so I would stop writing because there were so many possible endings. Then I discovered that you can write an ending, read the story. If you don't like it, you can write a different ending. You don't have to commit until you find the right ending. And once I gave myself permission to write the wrong ending 4 or 5 times till I found the right one, suddenly I could finish stories. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
And my advice also would be finish something. Just the act of having finished something makes it much easier to finish all the other things. So if you just choose one at random, and again, do not put pressure on yourself for it to be great. Just finished. And then suddenly others are easier to finish.
Yeah. Don't
You're gonna
make
be
it
awesome.
be good.
Yeah, good luck.
That's like the
We
biggest
believe
thing.
in you.
Thank
Doesn't have to be
you.
good.
Just has to be done.
Hi.
Hi.
So my question was actually on selling books. You've all mentioned that you wanted to be at a specific place in the bookstore, at a specific shelf. How has online sales changed that? And from the publishing standpoint,
entirely.
does the fact that we can now have a only ebook release effectively mean that you can take more risks with what you can publish?
Well, first of all, let's say things have changed substantially. We are, as publishers, marketing in a completely different way. We are doing a lot more direct-to-consumer marketing because there are not a lot of bookstores anymore, sadly and tragically, that people can go into and browse the shelves like you used to. The online platforms are very bad browsers. They're not good for discoverability. So what we try to do is do as much as we can to, tell you about the books that we're excited about and give you a reading list. It's one of the reasons we're at a convention like this. We come to a lot more Comic-Cons now because we get to talk directly to you as the readers and put books in your hand and say, this is an amazing book, read this first book, and we guarantee you're going to go out and buy all the others. I mean, why people are asking me all weekend, why are you giving me this book for free? What's the catch? I'm like, we're drug dealers. The first taste is free. And it's honestly true. It's become much harder. And yes, I think because it is a little more non-traditional, there is an ability to take more chances to a certain degree, but it depends on the genres. I mean, I think that romance still has a very healthy online-only presence. I think it has, in science fiction and fantasy, it never quite worked, because the readers aren't doing that and aren't interested.
Also, speaking both as a reader and a writer, as a writer, this idea that a book should cost $1 is how we're all going to starve to death. You know, so many people are pumping out the ebook only releases and undervaluing themselves in a horrifying way, because Amazon, which is not our friend, has created this idea that a book costs $1. But again, I mentioned earlier, grew up super poor, deep poverty. Physical books have a long tail. You read the book and it goes to the used bookstore, or the library buys the book and it goes to the Friends of the Library sale. After the used bookstore, which still costs more than I could afford as a child, the book goes to a yard sale where it maybe costs $2 now. And from there, it goes to a garbage box in the flea market and it costs $0.25. I love ebooks for their accessibility. They are important, but our marginalized groups, you know, our at-risk youth, our people with no money, our homeless people, our folks that can't afford those ebooks are getting shut out more and more. And while I try really hard not to, when I hear people say ebooks are the future, what I hear is poor people don't deserve to read.
The ebooks are wonderful for people who have devices to read them on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I have a question, I guess, coming to fantasy from Tolkien. I kind of see language as an integral part of creating your believable fantasy world. I'm terrible at making up languages. Is it really, I guess as authors, do you feel that it's really necessary to have even if you're dealing in a fantasy world with multiple races, do they all have to have a different language, or do you have to represent that somehow in the writing?
Yeah, I think Tolkien is unique in his ability to like make up whole cloth a new language. Like they made up Dothraki for the TV show of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, exactly.
But like it was a linguist they hired after the fact to make a language for them.
Yeah, George has admitted that he had like 6 words. That was
Yeah.
it.
So I think that's beyond the skill set of the vast majority of people. It can be nice if you're making up like individual words to have them have like a similar sound pattern or have a similar like series of root words to make it seem more cohesive. But like plenty of fantasy worlds don't have any made up words.
Yeah. And I think too many made up words makes readers' eyes glaze.
It does.
So
it does. Or even
it
like
becomes
Russian words. Like I have Russian words in my first book, and I get a lot of like, but Katherine, that's confusing. And I might have cut it back for my next 2 because there were too many, you know? Like,
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we actually do when we're writing cover copy is we try to put as few in-world terms and names in there as possible, because we want it accessible to the most mainstream audience. So if we start throwing in weird fantasy names and places, we know that people are just going to get confused. So if you want to make the book seem accessible, I think it makes it easier not to overburden yourself with a made-up language. And there's certainly ways of implying that 2 races speak a different language. I mean, this is something we've just been dealing with in Jenna's second book.
Yes.
So
Yes, it can get very awkward when you're having to remember, oh yeah, these 2 people don't speak the same language, so you can't just have them have a conversation without thinking about, okay, what language are they conversing in? How are they figuring out how to talk to each other? And are things getting lost in the translation?
But nonetheless, the whole book is written in English, and there's no invented language. It's just clear that one person speaks one language and one person speaks another. So.
And one thing, especially when you're writing this totally made-up fantasy world, none of these people is actually speaking English, right? Because so you're really basically the translator. So you're translating into English, and all those other words, you don't need them.
I will say like an interesting old-fashioned way to do it is like in the Jungle books, when the animals are talking, they use old-fashioned informal English, like thee and thou, to show that they are the animals talking, versus like when people talk, they use normal English. And I thought it was a cool use of like existing language patterns to indicate differences. So that's pretty old-fashioned.
Hi.
Hi. I'm making my first story, and one of my biggest things with writing fantasy is that I keep on falling into tropes. So I just want to know if there's any like techniques or ways that you can just sort of like avoid them or subvert them or any way like that.
Are you falling into tropes or are you falling into cliches? Because those are not the same thing.
Cliches, I meant.
Okay, yeah, tropes are not bad. That's like the landing page of TV tropes, is tropes are not bad. There are negative tropes, there are toxic tropes, there are tropes that are currently overused and we need to avoid, but tropes themselves are not bad. If you're falling into cliche ways of thinking, you need to stop, look at it, and ask yourself why. I'm super queer. I came out of the closet when I was 14, and yet if you look at my early work, every time there's a happy ending, it's a man and a woman. It's always a very heteronormative happy ending, because even though I thought I was not homophobic, because I'm queer as hell, I had internalized so much of the schema of story from the culture around me that when I thought of a happy ending, I thought of a man and a woman. And I had to admit that I could be queer as hell and still carry lingering homophobia. I have a fat girlfriend. She's bigger than I am, and I think she's the most beautiful woman in the world, but sometimes I think I look like a hippo because I still have fat phobia, because I live in this culture. You have to stop and examine yourself when you fall into those toxic cliches and those bad ways of thinking and ask, what don't I like and thus don't want to see? Because until you dig those bits out and start hammering on them, you're gonna keep doing it, and we all keep doing it always and forever. It's an unlearning process. We can always be better tomorrow than we are today.
But I think there are cliches too that are just our universal way of speaking to us. If I say, you know, once upon a time a young woman set out to seek her fortune, that's really a cliche in lots and lots of fairy tales. But it's also, if you're going to go out on your first job interview, or you're going to go to college for the first time, or you're entering a new middle school, you are still that young person going out to seek your fortune. And so some of the cliches, hammer the rest off it and say, why is this a cliche? Is something that speaks to us almost universally. Just make it your own and throw it out there.
I'm sorry, that's not a cliche, that's a motif.
You would say that's a
There are
motif?
different things.
The farm boy saving the world, would that be a cliche or is that a motif?
General, yeah.
Yeah, that's too general. We would need more detail. The blonde is the stupidest person in the room is a cliche.
That's a joke, isn't it? Wouldn't you say?
Oh, no, I grew up blonde. Believe me, it is not a joke. You know, the blonde is the stupidest person in the room is a cliche. The woman trips and falls into the arms of the man every time is a cliche. The black guy dies first in the horror movie is a cliche. But the hero's journey is a motif. It is a structure the story hangs around. The chosen one is not actually a cliche, it's a motif. The Arne Thompson Index to Motifs in Folklore and Fairy Tale is an incredibly Eurocentric way of looking at this structural system, but it is a structural system that we have found echoes of around the world. Folklorically speaking, these are all motifs and they are necessary components of the construction of story.
But we have 3 more minutes, so let's see if we can get one more question.
Can I give one answer to you? One thing to do, whatever your first idea is for anything, reject it. That's a really good way to avoid the cliches, because the first thing that's going to come to your mind is the cliche because you've seen it so many times. So just say, okay, this is my first idea. Next.
So I'm working on a story, and I was wondering about kind of how to find or how to draw the line, if we can, between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation, because I feel like that's not all, like, it's a mistake that people make very often. And your thoughts on that?
I think you mentioned Tempest's.
Yeah, the writing the other class that Tempest, it's Bradshaw, right?
Yes.
I don't say her name very often except for Hey You. Nisi Shaw and Tempest do a class. It's an online course called Writing the Other. They do occasionally have scholarships, but they prefer to reserve those for people who really can't pay. So please, if you possibly can, pay for the course. And they are there to do this emotional labor for you. They are there to answer these questions and do this heavy lifting in a safe, secured space. Because that is part of the problem. If you come up to someone and go, hey, can I use this element of your culture? You are asking them to work for you for free, and you are possibly treading on bruises that people before you left, so the answer you get may not be fair, but it will be sincere.
Yeah.
If you're local to the Seattle area, I think Nisi Shaw also does frequently, it used to be at conventions, she would do just some panels and things on Writing the Other.
Mm-hmm. And there's also a book, her book, Writing the Other. But yeah, I mean, if you wanted to write an indigenous story, for example, what you called Native American in the United States. And you start from the point that you don't know what traditional territory you live on, and you're already writing the story in your head. I think you're like 5 steps ahead of time. I know I live in Vancouver, and in the area that was the traditional territory of the Musqueam. I'm not gonna write an Indigenous story, but I know that fact. So if you're already like crafting characters and taking bits of things that maybe you saw on TV or in a movie, and you haven't, figured out some basic bits like that, you are 5 steps ahead. And we normally are 5 steps ahead because we think we know it all because we once saw Dances with Wolves. And we feel like that very often, but that's just like your starting point, like for something. But yeah, so don't think that you know basically anything. Start from a position of not knowing, of humility.
Thank you very much.
I think that takes us to 1:15, so thank you so much for being here. Sorry.
I believe we're all signing
yes, I was
now.
just going to say, everyone go over to the writer's blocks, table 3 and 4, and all these people will be signing for Jenna and Silvia. We have a limited quantities of their books available for you, so go get in line. Thank you very much.